Christmas night was colder than the snow outside. At 73, I stood in the dark with nowhere to go. My own family had decided I no longer belonged. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Eleanor and I never imagined I would be telling a story like this at my age. I had lived long enough to believe that some things were unbreakable. Family dinners, shared holidays, the quiet promise that blood meant belonging. That belief carried me through widowhood, through years of slower mornings and careful steps, through a loneliness that never screamed but settled deep in my bones. Christmas for me was never about gifts or decorations. It was about warmth. About sitting together. About knowing without asking that I had a place. That night I wore my best coat, the one I saved for moments that mattered. I brushed my hair slowly, the way my late husband used to smile at, and wrapped my scarf a little tighter than usual, even before stepping outside my room. Snow drifted down softly, almost beautiful, the kind that looks harmless until the wind cuts through you. From inside the house I could hear laughter through the walls. My son's voice, my daughter-in-law's, the clink of dishes, music playing low in the background. It sounded like a celebration I was meant to be part of. Sounded like home. I had spent weeks preparing for Christmas. From the small bedroom I tried to stay contained within. I planned meals, folded napkins, wrapped gifts with hands that shook more than they used to. I kept reminding myself not to ask for help, not to take up space, not to become a burden. I told myself patience was a virtue. That love meant adapting to the needs of the younger generation. After all, I had raised my son to be strong, capable, independent. I believed, truly believed, that had earned me a little grace. Earlier that evening I felt something shift. Conversations paused when I entered the room. My daughter-in-law's eyes slid away from mine. My son checked his phone again and again, his jaw tight, his smile thin and distracted. When I asked if everything was all right, he said yes too quickly, too easily. I told myself it was just holiday stress. Christmas does that to people, I thought. Families get tense. I didn't want to imagine anything worse. Dinner passed in stiff politeness. I felt like a visitor in a house I had once helped turn into a home. I laughed when it seemed expected. I stayed quiet when the air sharpened. Over the years, I had learned that silence can be a kind of survival, especially when the roof over your head depends on someone else's patience. When the argument began, it didn't explode. It crept in. A comment about space. A remark about stress. A suggestion that things were harder than they needed to be. And then, carefully, the idea that I didn't really need to be there anymore. I answered calmly, my voice steady even as my chest tightened. I said I wasn't asking for much. I reminded them it was Christmas. I reminded them that family mattered. What came next struck harder than any raised hand ever could. I was told it would be best if I left. That I was making things difficult. That I should understand. I looked at my son, my child, waiting for him to interrupt, to correct it, to laugh and say this was all a misunderstanding. He didn't. He lowered his eyes and said nothing. I gathered my purse with fingers that felt numb. No one offered me a coat. No one asked where I planned to go. The door opened and cold air rushed in as if it had been waiting for this moment. I stepped outside. The porch light clicked off behind me. The house went silent. Standing there, snow settling on my shoulders, I felt something break. Not just my sense of home but my belief that age earns compassion. I had given my life to others, piece by piece, and now at 73 I was alone on Christmas night, learning how easily belonging can be taken away. I didn't know then how deeply this night would change me. I only knew I was finished pretending that patience meant accepting humiliation. And as the cold seeped through my coat, something inside me set firm, not into anger but into resolve. I was 73 years old that winter. An age that sounds solid until you're living inside it. My name is Eleanor and for most of my life I was defined by what I gave. I was a wife for 46 years, until illness took my husband quietly in his sleep. I was a mother who packed lunches before dawn, stitched school costumes late at night, and sat through every recital and school play even when my feet ached from standing all day at work. Later I became a grandmother. The kind who never forgot a birthday, who kept extra toys tucked away in a hall closet, just in case someone needed comfort without asking. After my husband passed, my world grew smaller, but it wasn't empty. I learned how to live with quiet instead of fearing it. I learned how to stretch a pension, how to fix small things around the house, how to cook meals for one without slipping into self-pity. I wasn't helpless and I wasn't fragile, but I was honest with myself. When my health began to slow me down, when my joints stiffened and my balance wavered, my son insisted I move in with him and his wife. He said it would only be temporary. He said it would be safer. He said family takes care of its own. I believed him because I wanted to. Because he was my son. Because I still carried memories of the boy who used to run to the door when I came home from work. The teenager who pretended not to need me but hugged me anyway before leaving for college. I trusted that version of him more than the man standing in front of me now, distracted and distant. Living with them changed the rhythm of my days in ways I didn't expect. I reshaped myself to fit their routine. I woke early so I wouldn't be in the way during breakfast. I kept my belongings neatly confined to a single room. I asked permission before using the washing machine, before rearranging anything, before speaking too much. I told myself these were small sacrifices, the cost of harmony. My daughter-in-law was polite enough, but there was always a tightness in her smile, a tone that suggested every kindness I received was something I should be grateful for. Before Christmas, my emotional state was fragile but hopeful. I convinced myself the tension was temporary. I believed the holidays would soften everyone, remind us who we were to each other. I imagined us sitting together, sharing stories, laughing, feeling like a family again. I wanted Christmas to be proof that I still belonged somewhere, that time and age hadn't erased my value. I didn't ask for much. I helped where I could, folding laundry, watching my grandchild when asked, cooking meals on days when my hands were steady enough. I stayed out of arguments. I stayed out of the way. I believed that if I was patient enough, quiet enough, I would earn my place again. Looking back now, I can see how tired I truly was, not just in my body but in my spirit. I see how badly I wanted peace, even if it meant swallowing my own discomfort. I noticed the small slights, but I brushed them aside. I told myself families go through rough patches. I told myself love doesn't always look warm. What I didn't realize was that my silence was being mistaken for permission. That my patience was being read as weakness. And that the people I trusted most were already deciding what my place in their lives would be, without ever asking me. Before everything fell apart, my days followed a quiet, predictable rhythm. I woke before the rest of the house, partly out of habit and partly so I wouldn't be in anyone's way. I moved slowly through the kitchen, careful with every step, careful not to let a cabinet close too loudly. I brewed my tea and sat at the small table by the window, watching the neighborhood wake up. Engines starting, porch lights clicking off, the same routines unfolding each morning. There was comfort in that sameness. It reminded me that the world still moved with order, even if my place in it felt uncertain. I tried to make myself useful without being noticeable. If my daughter-in-law left a list on the counter, I followed it exactly, afraid that even one misstep would be taken as inconvenience. If there was no list, I stayed still. I folded laundry only when asked. I watched my grandchild for short stretches, always mindful of time. I cooked meals only on days when my hands felt steady enough to trust. I learned to pause before speaking, to weigh every word, because even gentle suggestions were often met with sighs, tight smiles, or silence that spoke louder than words. On the surface, I was treated politely. No one raised their voice. No one openly insulted me. But beneath that thin layer of courtesy ran a constant current of dismissal. My opinions drifted past unheard. Decisions were made without me, even when they directly affected my daily life. I learned about plans after they were already set, my role assumed rather than discussed, my presence treated as a detail instead of a person. There were moments that should have warned me. Jokes about my age that lingered a little too long. Comments about how times have changed whenever I mentioned doing something differently. My daughter-in-law referring to the house as ours, casually, naturally, as if I were just passing through, even though I slept under the same roof. Each moment was small enough to excuse on its own. Together they formed a pattern I didn't want to see. I noticed how my presence altered the room. Conversations shortened. Laughter softened. When I entered, my son often found a reason to leave, checking his phone, stepping outside, disappearing into another room. I told myself he was busy. That he was stressed. That he carried responsibilities I no longer understood. I didn't want to believe he was avoiding me, so I chose easier explanations. As Christmas approached, I poured my energy into preparation. I wrapped gifts carefully, tying bows with fingers that weren't as steady as they once were. I wrote small notes in my uneven handwriting, hoping the effort would be noticed. I planned meals in my head, imagining familiar dishes filling the house with warmth. I believed holidays had a way of reminding people who they were to each other. I believed Christmas would soften the edges, reset whatever had gone wrong. But even then the warning signs were there, fluttering quietly. My suggestions about the celebration were brushed aside. I was told not to worry, that everything was handled. When I asked where I should sit for dinner, the answer was vague, almost evasive. I felt less like a member of the family and more like someone being carefully managed. So I stayed hopeful. Hope can be stubborn, especially when you've spent a lifetime holding families together. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself patience was the right choice. I didn't realize that while I was trying to preserve peace, others were quietly testing how far they could push me without resistance. By the time Christmas arrived, I was already standing on the edge of something I didn't yet understand. An unspoken decision that was about to become impossible to ignore. Christmas Day began with a heaviness I couldn't quite name. I woke before dawn, my sleep shallow and restless, my chest tight with a feeling I kept pushing away. When I stepped into the hallway, the house was already awake. I heard chairs scraping, low voices murmuring, sounds that stopped the moment I entered the room. My daughter-in-law smiled at me, but it never reached her eyes. My son barely looked up. The decorations were everywhere, but they felt like a performance. The tree sparkled, the table was set just right, music drifted softly through the room. From the outside it must have looked like a perfect holiday. From where I stood, it felt staged, as though I were a guest allowed to observe but not belong. Someone expected to sit quietly and not disturb the picture. I tried to help in the kitchen, wanting to feel useful, wanted. I was told everything was under control. When I offered to set the table, my daughter-in-law let out a tired sigh before handing me a small task, the kind you give to keep someone busy. The tone stung. I swallowed it and did what I was given, telling myself it was temporary. It was just one day. I could endure one day. As the afternoon stretched on, tension slipped into the room like a draft no one acknowledged. Small comments grew sharp around the edges. A remark about space. A complaint about stress. My name worked its way into the conversation in ways that made my stomach tighten. I tried to redirect things toward warmth, toward something lighter. I offered a gentle comment, a small joke. Nothing landed. The moment itself didn't arrive loudly. My daughter-in-law said she needed to talk. My son stood beside her, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the floor. She spoke carefully, rehearsed. She talked about boundaries, about how hard it had been having me there, about how I made things uncomfortable without meaning to. I listened with my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I told them I was doing my best. I reminded them it was Christmas. I said I didn't want to be a problem. My voice trembled, but I held it steady. I waited for my son to step in, to soften the moment, to say this wasn't what they meant, to protect me the way he once had. Instead he said it might be better if I left. Just for now, he added, as if that made it gentle. He said I would understand. He said they needed space. The room seemed to shrink around me. I looked from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, to speak up. No one did. My grandchild stared at the floor, silent. The quiet pressed down heavier than the words themselves. Humiliation rose in my throat, hot and bitter. I had raised this boy. I had sat with him through fevers and failures, held his hand through fear and heartbreak. And now, on Christmas Day, he was asking me to leave as if I were something he could no longer manage. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and asked where I was supposed to go. The answers were vague. Somewhere safe, they said. Somewhere else. No one offered a ride. No one offered to help me pack. I gathered my coat, my purse, the few things I could carry. As I walked toward the door, the music kept playing behind me, cheerful, completely out of place. The door opened and cold air rushed in, stealing my breath. I stepped outside and the door closed without ceremony. Standing there, snow beginning to fall, the truth settled over me. I hadn't simply been asked to leave a house. I had been pushed out of a family that no longer saw me as a person, only as a problem to be removed. The cold sank into me faster than I expected. It wasn't just the air, it was the shock. I stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the closed door as if it might open again, as if someone inside would suddenly realize what they had done and call my name. It didn't happen. The house remained still, warm light glowing through the windows, the muted sounds of celebration carrying on without me. I walked slowly down the steps, my boots crunching against the snow, each step heavier than the last. My hands trembled, not only from the cold but from disbelief. My mind kept replaying the conversation over and over, searching for a mistake. Had I misunderstood? Had I said something wrong? That is how humiliation works. It turns inward first. It convinces you to question yourself before you ever question the people who hurt you. I didn't have a plan. No one had given me time to make one. I ended up sitting on a bench at a nearby bus stop, the metal biting through my coat. Cars passed in steady lines, their headlights smearing through the tears I tried so hard to hold back. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and focused on my breathing, telling myself not to cry, not out there where anyone could see. But the tears came anyway, quiet, steady, unstoppable. The shame was almost worse than the fear. I felt exposed, discarded, like something that had outlived its usefulness. I thought about all the years I had spent putting others first, about how many times I had swallowed my pride just to keep peace. And there I was on Christmas night with nowhere to go, realizing how my entire life had narrowed into that single unbearable moment. I considered calling my son. I took my phone out of my purse and held it in my hands, my finger hovering over his name. A part of me wanted to beg, to apologize for existing, for taking up space, just to be allowed back inside where it was warm. That part of me was loud, insistent, desperate. But another part of me, quieter, steadier, told me to stop. It asked me what returning would cost. It reminded me how it felt to be dismissed, to be spoken about as a problem instead of treated like a person. I sat there with the phone resting in my lap, caught between dignity and fear, each pulling me in opposite directions. I felt trapped by my age, by my dependence, by the assumptions people make about women like me, that we should be grateful for scraps, that we should accept whatever treatment we're given without complaint. The night stretched on endlessly. With every passing minute, the betrayal sank deeper, hardening from shock into something heavier, something permanent. Eventually I found shelter for the night, but sleep refused to come. My thoughts circled endlessly. How had it come to this? When did I stop being a mother and become a burden? I felt invisible, erased, as if decades of love and labor had been wiped away in a single evening. Yet beneath the pain, something else began to take shape, a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. Sitting there alone, stripped of excuses and illusions, I understood something I could no longer ignore. Silence hadn't protected me. Patience hadn't saved me. And if I stayed quiet now, nothing would ever change. That realization didn't bring comfort, but it brought focus. And for the first time since the door closed behind me, I understood that this night, this humiliation, was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I had been avoiding for far too long. The morning after Christmas felt unreal, as if I had woken up inside someone else's life. Outside, the world carried on without pause. People returned gifts, swept up torn wrapping paper, laughed about leftovers and late nights. And there I was, carrying a quiet wound no one could see. My body still ached from the cold, but the deeper pain moved slower, heavier, settling into places I didn't have words for yet. I moved through the day in a fog. Simple things, holding a cup, tying my shoes, felt strangely difficult, as if my hands no longer trusted the world to stay steady. My mind kept returning to the night before, replaying it in fragments. The words. The silences. The way my son couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes. Each memory landed like a small blow, not dramatic, not loud, but relentless. What hurt most wasn't only that I had been told to leave. It was how easily it happened. There was no real argument, no hesitation, no moment of doubt. I had been dismissed as casually as something that no longer fit the room. That realization settled deep in my chest and tightened every breath. I felt isolated in a way I hadn't experienced since my husband died. Back then, grief had come with support, cards in the mail, phone calls, people checking in. This was different. This was loneliness wrapped in shame. I didn't want to tell anyone what had happened. Saying it out loud felt like admitting failure, like confessing that I had misjudged my own child. My thoughts circled the same questions again and again. Should I have spoken up sooner? Should I have pushed back, set firmer boundaries, demanded respect? Or was this always going to happen, the inevitable result of years spent shrinking myself so others could feel comfortable? Part of me still wanted to smooth things over. To call my son. To suggest we talk. To pretend this was all a misunderstanding that could be undone with the right words. That instinct, to protect family at any cost, had been trained into me over decades. Women my age are taught to endure quietly, to be grateful, to make ourselves smaller so no one feels inconvenienced by our needs. But another voice, one I had ignored for far too long, began to speak with more clarity. It reminded me that love without respect is not love at all. That forgiveness without accountability is not peace. I saw then that returning without change would only teach them that they could discard me again whenever it suited them. I felt trapped, not by walls or locked doors but by expectations. By the belief that age makes you disposable. By the fear that speaking up would make me seem ungrateful, dramatic, or difficult. That invisible trap had kept me silent for years, and it had led me straight to that cold Christmas night. As the hours passed, something shifted inside me. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed. It sharpened. It became something I could follow instead of something that crushed me. I began to understand that my silence had been convenient. For everyone but me. I didn't know yet what I would do or how I would do it. I only knew I could not return to the role they had assigned me. I could not pretend that what happened was acceptable. The woman who had stood in the snow the night before was still hurting, but she was also awake. And once you see the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. There was something my son and daughter-in-law never knew about me. Something I rarely spoke about, not because it was a secret but because I never wanted it to define me. Long before my health slowed me down, long before I learned to move carefully and speak softly, I learned how to prepare for hard times. My husband and I lived through layoffs, medical bills, and years when every dollar mattered. We learned early that real security doesn't come from comfort. It comes from planning. After my husband passed, people expected me to fall apart. I didn't. I grieved him deeply in quiet moments when the house felt too large and too still, but I also took responsibility for what we had built together. I organized every document. I reviewed every account. I made decisions with a clear, steady mind because I knew no one else would step in and do it for me. I didn't talk about it much. I didn't want to seem proud or defensive. I believed family didn't need explanations and trust should have been enough. What my son never understood was that the situation I was living in was not as simple as he believed. Years earlier, my husband and I had been careful. We had structured things deliberately. I had legal rights. Real protections that didn't disappear just because I moved into my son's home. I also had savings set aside, untouched and quietly waiting, meant for emergencies exactly like this. I kept the paperwork somewhere no one ever bothered to look because no one thought to. They assumed I was dependent. They assumed I had nothing left. Sitting alone after Christmas, I went through everything slowly and deliberately. I laid out the documents, read every page, checked every date and signature. My hands were steadier than they had been in weeks. With every line I reviewed, the panic eased. Facts have a way of cutting through emotion. They ground you. They remind you where you actually stand. That was when I realized something important. What had happened to me wasn't just unkind, it was wrong. Not just morally wrong but legally wrong. I hadn't been evicted properly. I hadn't been consulted or given notice. I had been pushed out through pressure and neglect. There were laws meant to protect people like me. People assumed to be too old, too tired, or too afraid to fight back. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something close to control. I wasn't plotting revenge out of anger. I was reclaiming ground I had given up through misplaced trust. I began making quiet calls, asking careful questions, listening far more than I spoke. I didn't tell my son what I was doing. I didn't confront anyone. I let them believe the story they had created, that I was broken, embarrassed, and gone. But the truth was I was planning. Fully. Methodically. The way you do when you've learned that survival depends on patience. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to beg. I only needed to stop hiding the strength I had been carrying all along. And once I made that decision, everything began to move in a direction no one else saw coming. The clarity came quietly, early one morning while the house I was staying in was still asleep. I sat alone at a small table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, watching the steam rise and disappear into the air. In that stillness, something finally settled inside me. I understood what I had been circling for days. I didn't need permission to protect myself anymore. I didn't need approval to demand dignity. What I needed was action. For years, I had tolerated discomfort because it felt easier than confrontation. I told myself that peace was worth the cost, that keeping quiet was the mature thing to do. That morning, I admitted the truth I had been avoiding. The peace I had been preserving was never mine. It belonged to everyone else. And it had been paid for with my silence. I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped worrying about how my son might react. I stopped imagining how my daughter-in-law would twist the story to suit herself. I shifted my focus away from emotions and toward facts. Away from appearances and toward what had actually happened. For the first time, I wasn't trying to protect anyone else's comfort. My first step was small, but it was deliberate. I reached out to someone I trusted. Someone who didn't see me as fragile, inconvenient, or difficult. I explained what had happened calmly, without tears, without apology. Saying the words out loud felt heavier than I expected, but once I began, they came steadily. I wasn't asking for sympathy. I was asking for guidance. From there, things started to move. I gathered documents I had kept for years, papers I once believed I would never need. I checked dates, addresses, and agreements. I wrote down everything that had happened on Christmas night, capturing each detail while it was still sharp. Not to relive the pain, but to anchor the truth firmly in place. Each step grounded me further. Fear still hovered at the edges, but it no longer controlled me. I wasn't acting out of anger or revenge. I was acting out of self-respect. There is a difference, and at my age I finally understood it. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't threaten or hint. I let my son believe that forcing me out had solved his problem. I let my daughter-in-law assume she had won. There is a quiet power in being underestimated. People grow careless when they think you're defeated. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had chosen myself. I had crossed a line inside my own heart, the one that separates endurance from acceptance. I knew what came next would not be easy. Confrontation never is. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't returning to beg or explain. I was returning with something far more solid than emotion. I was returning with the truth. I returned on a gray morning, the kind that feels suspended between seasons. The snow had melted into slush along the curb, leaving the street dull and wet. The house looked exactly the same as the night I had been forced out, warm, settled, confident in its comfort. I stood there for a moment, steadying my breath, reminding myself why I had come. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to cry. I was there to speak plainly. The knock sounded louder than I expected. Firm. Final. My daughter-in-law opened the door, and her expression shifted in quick succession. Surprise first, then irritation, then something closer to unease. She hadn't expected to see me again, not so soon, and certainly not standing that straight. My son appeared behind her, confusion tightening his face. For a moment the air hung heavy and silent between us. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The living room felt smaller than I remembered, as if the walls themselves were listening. The decorations were already coming down, Christmas erased as though it had never happened. I asked them both to sit. My voice didn't waver, and that seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever could. I told them exactly why I was there. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in facts. What had happened on Christmas night, the rights I had, the lines that had been crossed. I watched my son's posture shift as he realized this wasn't a conversation he could dismiss or talk his way out of. When my daughter-in-law tried to interrupt, I lifted my hand gently and continued. I explained what I had learned since leaving. About the protections I had in place. About the consequences of forcing someone out without process. About the assumptions they had made, that I was powerless, dependent, and too ashamed to respond. With every sentence, their certainty weakened, slipping away piece by piece. The room fell quiet in a way it never had before. My son finally looked at me, not past me, not through me, but directly at me. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. Or fear. It didn't matter which. I told them I hadn't come to punish anyone. I had come to correct what had been done. I set clear boundaries, ones I should have drawn long ago. I explained what would happen next, calmly, without threats or raised voices. The truth carried its own weight. It didn't need help from anger. My daughter-in-law's confidence collapsed first. Her voice rose, then faltered. My son remained still, his hands clasped together, realizing too late that silence has a cost. They had believed that pushing me out had solved their problem. They were wrong. As I stood to leave, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph. Not revenge. Relief. I had spoken. I had been heard. And the balance in that house had shifted. Permanently. The surprise wasn't my return. It was the fact that I returned unafraid. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, the way truth often does when it's finally allowed into the open. At first, there were tense conversations behind closed doors, ones I wasn't present for but could still feel in the days that followed. Messages went unanswered. Plans were quietly cancelled. The confidence my son and daughter-in-law once carried fractured into something brittle, uncertain, and strained. What changed most was the balance of power. For the first time, they were reacting instead of deciding. They had believed they were in control, that forcing me out would simplify their lives and end the discomfort. Instead, it exposed them. Not just legally or financially but socially. Family members began asking questions. Details didn't line up. The story they had told, that I left willingly, that it was mutual, couldn't withstand the truth for very long. There were practical consequences too. The kind that don't bend for excuses or emotions. Agreements had to be reviewed. Decisions revisited. Boundaries formally enforced. What they once assumed belonged to them by default was no longer secure. I didn't take pleasure in watching them scramble, but I didn't turn away either. Accountability has a way of unsettling people who aren't used to it. My son struggled the most. He reached out, trying to smooth things over, suggesting compromises that would quietly return everything to the way it had been. But the way things were had led us here. I told him calmly, without anger, that there would be no return to silence, no pretending that Christmas night hadn't happened. He had made a choice then. Now he had to live with what followed. My daughter-in-law reacted differently. Her frustration spilled outward. She blamed stress, misunderstandings, everyone but herself. That response carried consequences of its own. People listen more carefully when patterns begin to repeat, when behavior can no longer hide behind politeness and charm. The image she worked so hard to maintain began to crack. What surprised me most was how steady I felt through it all. I wasn't driven by anger. I wasn't seeking to embarrass or punish anyone. I was simply refusing to disappear. And that refusal changed everything. The house that once felt close to me no longer held the same power. The fear I had carried for so long quietly slipped away. Family dynamics shifted, permanently. Some relationships cooled. Others ended altogether. But what remained mattered more than harmony ever could. It was truth. And for the first time in a very long while, it was working in my favor. Victory didn't arrive with applause or raised voices. It came quietly, the way real change often does. Piece by piece, I reclaimed what I had lost. Not just a place to live, but the certainty that I mattered. I secured my independence first. A space that was mine alone, where I could close the door without fear of being asked to leave again. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was safe, warm, and chosen by me. That alone felt like a victory I had waited years to claim. The conversations that followed were difficult, but they were no longer one-sided. My son reached out, his tone cautious and unsure, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He spoke about regret, about pressure, about how things had spiraled further than he ever intended. I listened without interrupting, the way I always had. But this time I didn't rush to soften the moment or absorb the blame. I told him what that night had cost me. I told him what it meant to be 73 years old and made to feel disposable. He listened. Whether he truly understood, I can't say. But the silence that once protected him no longer protected anyone. There were practical resolutions as well. Arrangements were clarified. Responsibilities were acknowledged. Boundaries were drawn where none had existed before. I didn't demand punishment or humiliation. I demanded respect. And in doing so, I learned something important. Respect doesn't require permission. It requires boundaries clearly set and firmly held. My daughter-in-law kept her distance. That was her choice. I didn't chase reconciliation or explanations. I had spent too many years chasing peace at my own expense. This time, peace came from standing my ground, from knowing I would not be moved again by someone else's convenience or comfort. What surprised me most was the calm that followed. I slept better. I ate better. My body felt lighter, as if it had finally been allowed to rest. The fear that once followed me from room to room had faded. In its place was something steadier, confidence earned the hard way through loss and resolve. My family realized too late what they had broken on Christmas night. They had mistaken patience for weakness, silence for consent. By the time they understood the cost of that mistake, the rules had changed. I was no longer asking to belong. I belonged to myself. On my terms, I rebuilt a life that felt honest and whole. I learned to celebrate small victories, Morning light through a window, quiet evenings, the freedom to say no without apology. I didn't need to raise my voice or seek revenge. The outcome spoke for itself. I was no longer standing in the cold, waiting for a door to open. I had found my own way home. Christmas means something different to me now. It used to represent endurance, showing up, staying quiet, keeping the peace no matter the cost. I believed that if I loved hard enough and asked for little enough, I would always have a place. That belief kept me small for a long time. It took being thrown out at 73 for me to finally see the truth. What I learned is simple, though it isn't easy to accept. Love without boundaries is not kindness. Family without respect is not safety. And age does not erase your right to dignity. I spent years confusing patience with strength, believing silence was the price of belonging. It wasn't. It was the reason I was treated as disposable. I don't regret being gentle. I don't regret giving my life to others. Those choices shaped who I am, and I refuse to be ashamed of them. But I do regret waiting so long to choose myself. I regret believing that standing up for myself would make me difficult, ungrateful, or alone. The truth is, standing up for myself is what finally brought me peace. I am still an elderly woman. My body moves slower now. My steps are careful. But I am not invisible. I am not weak. And I am certainly not finished. Strength doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits quietly, gathering itself, until the moment it's needed most. If you're listening to this and you feel trapped, by expectations, by family roles that no longer honor you, by the fear that it's too late to change, please hear me. It is never too late to draw a line. It is never too late to protect your self-respect. And it is never too late to walk away from a door that was closed to you unfairly. I survived that Christmas night. More than that, I reclaimed myself because of it. I didn't win by hurting anyone. I won by refusing to disappear. And that is a victory no one can ever take from me. If this story touched you in any way, please remember this. Age does not erase your worth, and silence is never your obligation. If you've ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect you, you are not weak for surviving, and you are not wrong for choosing yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Until next time, take care of your heart and never forget your value.